Welcome to the Imaginaries.
So, today we're going to talk about something exciting here on the podcast.
Are we?
Yes, we are.
Good.
Hello.
Hello.
My name is Kendra, and my co-host Tony is on the other end of the line. Say hi.
Hi.
We are the Imaginaries podcast, and we are going to talk about hard sci-fi today. Or at least we're going to try and figure out what hard sci-fi is, because I'm not sure I know, but I have a general idea, and I feel like most people have a general idea. Where are you at on hard sci-fi, Tony?
I'm at the place where I think we should have a conversation about defining what we want hard sci-fi to be.
Okay, well...
what we want hard sci-fi to be. There we go.
Okay, but I think there is a sort of working definition floating around out there, and we've talked about it a little bit in the past on the podcast. So if you were to sum up what the general assumption is of what hard sci-fi is, what would you say that most people assume it is?
I would say most people would say it is congruent with what we currently know of what science currently says about the physical universe and what it predicts for the future. For example, a book that features perhaps travel between the planets but not the stars because the speed of light cannot be exceeded would tend towards hard sci-fi. I would also say, and this will be a point that we will pick up on later, that hard sci-fi tends to be more focused on accuracy as far as the physical sciences are concerned. So you might have a hard sci-fi book that is labeled very hard because it is really attentive when it comes to the laws of physics, but maybe plays fast and loose with biology or something. In terms of what I think of as a pure hard sci-fi book, it would be one that absolutely and accurately represents science as we know it today in every discipline it uses in its fiction.
Uh-huh. I feel like maybe we need to develop something a little more specific or something a little bit more easy to sum up in a sentence or two, because all of that seems to be true, and I would say, at least in a general way, that all seems to be true of hard sci-fi, but it doesn't make describing hard sci-fi easier to someone who's interested in distinguishing quote-unquote hard sci-fi from quote-unquote non-hard sci-fi. Mm-hmm. I don't know how useful this word or this term is, and so we kind of want to dig into it a little bit, and that's the point of us fumbling through this definition here for you guys at the outset.
Indeed.
I would pose a question to you
moi?
To moi. Well, I don't know. What is the you version of moi?
I think it's vu. At least Miss Piggy makes me think that.
I think Miss Piggy should be a part of every hard sci-fi conversation.
Yes, obviously.
I would posit that we need to develop some sort of Mohs scale for hard sci-fi. Mohs scale determines or evaluates the quote-unquote hardness of material. So it's a physical sciences measurement scale.
Nice.
I just pictured that really bad.
No, that was awesome. That's meta and descriptive. I love it.
I wonder if we can maybe come up with a term to evaluate hard sci-fi that's more useful to people along the lines of something like the Mohs scale. So
how about the moles scale for Kendra Mullison and for mulling it over and
mulled cider
and
fall.
For mulled cider, obviously.
that was terrible. Okay.
Yes.
So let's just dive in at the top and start messing our way through a little bit. What do you think some of the misconceptions about hard sci-fi are? Maybe we can find our way closer to a better working definition if we talk about what doesn't work. And when we put together the show notes 2 weeks ago before I got the flu, for today's podcast, we talked about how, I was throwing all of these texts in a list that you were like, I don't know if that's hard sci-fi. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. Well, sorry, what did you ask? What was the question there?
Deep. under the many layers of psychosis and flu brain. The question was, what are some of the misconceptions about hard sci-fi? Or how can we winnow down the definition a little bit by looking at what it isn't?
Okay, so I would say misconception number one is that a work is either hard science fiction or it is not. As I said a couple minutes ago, I think that there is some inclination for writers, not just modern writers, I'm thinking actually mostly of historical writers here, to be really accurate when it came to physics or engineering or the universe as we understand it via physical natural laws, but maybe to play around with biology or chemistry or certainly any of the social sciences if they were thinking about folks on large scales or even small scales. In part, I think that's because something like ecology, if you were writing in the 40s, 50s, 60s, wasn't as developed as we understand it today. So obviously there's shifts in what we understand, and, you know, if we compare a book that's, say, pre-Einsteinian understanding of physics, obviously that sort of science fiction book would be different than post, and I'm struggling to come up with an example here. I think we may be going back too far for me to come up with anything. But I would say that either or instead of... I wouldn't even necessarily say it's a spectrum of hardness to softness, even though you suggested the moles scale a few moments ago. I wonder if there's another way to sort of think about hard science fiction. Maybe aspects of hardness or something.
Yeah. I hope we can kind of dig into what some of those might be. I still think that there might be some sort of spectrum-based definition, but it won't be hardness. It won't be on a scale from hardness to softness, because that's a useless description. We've struggled with that binary for who knows how long at this point. But it might be hardness to something else. So let's leave that open and see if we can kind of figure out what that is later.
Yeah. So I would say... Also, as long as we're on this misconception train,
we are.
Misconception number 2 would be that hard science fiction is better science fiction. If the science is more accurate, or it more, it describes the universe as we understand it today, and the scientific precepts are sound, and there's no transporters, and there's no warp drive, and all of that, somehow that science fiction is better. That piece of writing, that text, is better as science fiction than a work that plays a little bit more loosely with those concepts.
Sure.
Hard social science fiction. That's actually something I wanted to talk about, because as we were thinking about this list, I think there are some examples of what hard science fiction is versus what non-hard science fiction is. And, if we're going back several decades, like... things that folks like Heinlein wrote, who had backgrounds in engineering and the physical sciences, tended to be where hard science fiction kind of got its start, like what it was understood to be, the standard against which hard science fiction is judged, and continues to be judged whether or not it is overt or less overt. And there are things like, for example, Star Trek and Star Wars that are less hard science fiction, or considered less hard science fiction, again, because they are either or. Is the physical science in this correct? Is it plausible? No, okay, you're not hard science fiction. But if I can take us all the way back to our podcast about novums.
Oh, that was so long ago.
I know, that was God knows how long. Months and months and months.
Months. That was, we recorded that last year, I think.
Yeah, I know. That was a 2016. So,
oh my goodness. We were different people.
That's true. I routinely change out my head, and ask me about my head next time. So, I remember when we talked about that, and dear listeners, if you haven't listened to that podcast, that is our first Beauty of Science Fiction podcast, which is still available on YouTube, and you might want to go back and check that one out. But essentially what that was saying is that, or what we were exploring in that podcast, is the idea of the novum, that one of the things that sets science fiction apart as a genre is that it has one or several, or a piece of science fiction has one or several central ideas or novums, new ideas, I should say, that it itself is exploring and developing and sort of circling around. So when we talked about science fiction standards like Star Trek is an example, obviously, I go back to a lot. Warp drive, the transporters, none of the, like, traditional kind of almost pulpy science fiction stuff was the novum for Star Trek. What the Star Trek novum was, we argued, what was the Federation, this idea that you could have this massive galaxy-spanning alliance of species that cooperated in this government structure that was egalitarian and democratic and all of these things. So in that way, we classified Star Trek as social science fiction. So I wonder, if we think about it in that way, if we think about social science fiction, or if we think of science fiction as potentially being social science fiction, is there a potential for there to be hard social science fiction? Social science fiction that is based in the best of what we understand about anthropology, or sociology, or psychology, or geography, or something, or one or more of those. And if so, sorry, I'm like totally monologuing this, but if we could define a hard social science fiction, if we looked at something like Star Trek from that perspective, how would the way that it treats that sort of egalitarian democratic governance be weighed against what we understand of psychology, sociology, political science, anthropology, and so forth? And would it stand up in the same way that, say, a really strict understanding of physical science stands up in a hard science fiction book?
So, I mean, I love the monologue. Do not ever sacrifice the monologue, because you monologue very well.
Thank you.
I think the issue that's going to arise when we talk about are there hard social science fiction books is that you're going to have people say immediately, well, yeah, but as long as they don't have warp drives. Mm-hmm, and so it's going to, I think we kind of circle back to this preconception that hard science fiction must issue all ideas that are non-congruent with maybe all of the current sciences of great repute. So it would be like, well, of course, you could have a book that espouses the highest ideals of the psychology profession, or a book which really gets at the heart of what historians are after, or archivists, and then you like, well, but then you're gonna have to, you need a world around that, and there's gonna be things that are not gonna line up with at least someone's experience in that field.
True. And I wonder if you could sort of make the opposite argument, like thinking about, say, I'm picking on Heinlein a lot today, and I don't mean to directly, but he's like the example for me. But say you have, something like a Heinlein-esque book that maybe pays really close attention to the physical science and, tries to craft a novel that is super hard sci-fi, but it just totally drops the fucking ball on character interactions, and the people who are in there and the people who are in there don't act like people, and the dialogue is stilted, and the choices that are made are awful and don't make any sense with how normal people behave, quote, normal people, unquote. And I'm not saying Heinlein books do this, but I think it would be as easy to take to task books that do focus more on the hard science, the hard physical science, I should say, and sacrifice the social science of character interactions, if we're sort of thinking about it in that way. Of course, we could also think about it as just being shitty character writing. So, I don't know. We could think about this in a lot of different ways.
I usually do fall back on that when I'm talking about Heinlein, shitty character interactions. But, so, has hard science fiction as a term become just another way of talking about distinguishing between genre fiction or quote-unquote pulpy fiction and the better stuff? Because I'm sitting here thinking, well, we have we have pulpy sci-fi, we have speculative sci-fi, we've got literary sci-fi, we've got hard sci-fi, and like each of those seems to have a flavor which attracts a certain kind of person. Like I would say, well, a lot of people like us have, we're pretty omnivorous about all of the different sci-fis. A lot of people will say, well, I like the Expanse kind of sci-fi. Speaking of James S.A. Corey and the Sci-Fi Channel show. But I don't like, say, Station 11, which would be like literary science fiction. And some people who really like Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel might be like, well, yeah, I love this, but I don't like, pulpy sci-fi like the Star Trek novels from the 80s. Or 90s. I don't even know when those books were written.
I'm sure they were both 80s and 90s.
I'm sure. I think the ones that I read were mostly... So my uncle had like 2 bookshelves full of Star Trek novels, so I'm sure they spanned more than one decade because there were hundreds.
A lot, yeah.
Hundreds. It was amazing. My parents never knew what revolutionary things were going in my head. Actually, this is a point I would make about sci-fi in general, and maybe we could spin it off in a podcast at some point. The innocence of sci-fi, the quote-unquote innocence of sci-fi, like, it's not talking about real life, so it's fine if our kids read it. They couldn't get anything dangerous from sci-fi. When it turns out that sci-fi is exactly what, like, inculcates this resistance movement that's, taking over the world or whatever.
Yep.
I don't know.
Yep.
A lot of people credit science fiction with helping them discover themselves, period. So it did for me, and it was pulpy sci-fi that played a big hand. But yeah, so like how much of our definition is just, I want to distinguish my taste as better than most people's taste?
Ooh, probably a lot. I mean, honestly, I would say a lot of it. But I do think it's also fun to just sort of tackle questions like these. I mean, it's fun for us to talk about. Hopefully, if you're listening to this, it's fun to think about because, sort of digging into these ideas that maybe meant something more than they mean now, or maybe meant something very different from what they meant originally, or maybe mean something different for you than they do for a friend who reads science fiction. I think it's interesting to consider, like, what we mean when we say hard sci-fi.
Yes. Okay, let's talk about it in the context of specific texts then. I mean, because otherwise we're going to be like, yeah, that's cool, but I don't know where to go from here. So let's make it specific here. So, like, pop quiz. I'm going to throw a text to you, and you're going to tell me whether you think it's hard sci-fi or not.
All right.
It's not really a pop quiz, because, like, we've had these notes together for a while. But
yeah, we have.
Okay, let's start at the top with the one that everyone thinks of first. The Martian.
Hard science fiction.
Why? And does it matter? Like, when we talk about it in relation to this specific text, why does it matter?
I would say it counts as hard science fiction because it's barely science fiction at all. It's essentially a drama of, say, a car crash or a plane crash or a fucking boat crash taken to the next logical extreme, which is humanity, we have members of our species in space, usually at any given point, and things sometimes go wrong. And it's conceivable that what could happen in... Oh, shit, I'm thinking of not The Martian. Fuck. I was totally, for some reason, thinking of Gravity. That was... Wow.
Gravity. Let's keep Gravity on the list. And let's talk about it in contrast to The Martian. They both came out... It was The Martian, Gravity, and Interstellar all came out within 6 months of each other. So let's talk about the trilogy.
Okay,
which
good.
ones are hard sci-fi and which ones aren't.
Okay, so for editing in the future, I can't believe I just did that. But all right,
I can't believe it's not butter.
Let's talk about the trilogy of Gravity, The Martian, and Interstellar.
Yeah.
So I would say that there are elements of hard science fiction in all of those.
Okay.
If we are considering from the point at which they were conceived and brought to life, and I'm thinking of all three of these as movies, so not bringing in the novel version of The Martian. Mm-hmm. But if we think of all three of those movies, and if I had to rank them in terms of hardness...
On our Mohs scale.
On our Mohs scale. I would put probably Gravity first, then The Martian, then Interstellar. What about
and
you?
Why? Well, I mean, I would probably say The Martian, and then Gravity, and then Interstellar. But a part of that comes from the backstory of The Martian, whereas the Gravity seemed to come from the director's desire to, like, show lots of really cool things happening in space, and then figure out a story that fit in around them, which is, like, great, and I like that, but it's not the same as The Martian, which was Andy Weir blogging away on his own time way before he got famous about specific challenges that would be encountered in Mars colonization. And then over time, these blog posts about what it would require to overcome these specific challenges evolved into narrative. And then over time, he actually took them all out of the blogs, recut them, edited them, and made them into the story that we now call The Martian, which has a great round central character. I think most people are like, yeah, Mark Watney is like a real person to them after they read the book or see the movie. He's one of the standout characters in science fiction adaptations lately, which is cool. But that background where it starts with here's a real world problem that we're actually tackling today because we're landing rovers on Mars and trying to figure out habitats to go on Mars. And we've actually got rockets that are being designed and tested to take us there. Let's figure out what the next inevitable step would be, which is this technology fails on us at some point. And how do we work through that? So I think of that takes me closer to what my personal definition of the hardest of hard sci-fi is, which is science fiction, which has at its heart the assumption that this is a future we will face. Maybe not the future, but a future which is the inevitable result or one of the inevitable results of this current ongoing project or situation on Earth that we have. So yeah. That would be my the reason why I would bump it ahead of Gravity.
Yeah, interesting. So, I mean, right there, just ranking those three movies, I see where our definitions of hard science fiction kind of diverge, because for me, the benchmark for hard science fiction is the accuracy. Not even necessarily the...
Oh, but Gravity was so inaccurate. Oh my goodness. It pissed me off so much. I know that the sandstorm on Mars, which starts The Martian, was one thing that would never happen because you wouldn't get enough force because the atmospheric pressure is too low. But gravity is predicated on the assumption that if you knock one thing out of orbit, it's going to knock into a bunch of other things. Only they had the orbits so far out, so far wrong. Literally everything hits everything else. And that doesn't happen. It could never happen. The entire premise of Gravity, which, by the way, is dominoes in space. It couldn't happen. And that's because the space station and these geostationary satellites and all the different components that they visit, all the different space place sets. What do you call them? Scene sets.
Sure.
Yes. Yeah, the moving the moving parts. They all are. They're shoved together in a small box for the sake of plot. But the science there is so lacking. In terms of orbital physics, at least.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess what I meant was not accuracy, because you're right. You're totally right. But rather...
And I love the movie. I I just groan,
there's a word I'm thinking of that I can't think of. But basically distance from what we can do today. And I think that you're totally right that, like the framework for what happens in The Martian is all there, and maybe we understand more about atmospheric pressure on Mars than we did like a year ago. Maybe we understand more about Martian soils than we did a year ago. Science marches on. That is a thing that happens. But the reason why I ranked gravity more highly on that scale was not because its science was better necessarily, but because there are folks going into space and doing spacewalks and performing the sort of science and space work that you see in gravity, and that's not yet happening in The Martian. So I guess for me, one of the most central, if not the most central part of what hard science fiction is in my head is that we can compare it to today and say, yes, what I'm seeing could happen.
Well, and I think The Martian could. I mean, there are obviously going to be variations in specific set pieces.
Yeah.
That I was headed for earlier. Like the ship in The Martian is probably going to be a different layout than the kind that gets sent up by Blue Origin or SpaceX or whatever. But like the things that the set pieces that are put out there are based on what's considered like standard rocket engineering today, or like standard habitat engineering today, and standard how do you fix a torn habitat? Well, of course you do it with duct tape. Like, you know, like they're using, generally speaking, like real materials too. So I don't know that that's as much of a distinguishing factor. Maybe we're just approaching it from different, you know, like the set pieces are more or.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you. And, you know, hearing you explain that, I would actually change my ranking to be more like your ranking because, well, for one, it's been a long time since I even watched part of Gravity, so I don't really remember exactly what happens. And I remember The Martian much more clearly. And so I wonder if a part of that ranking is, as well, the amount of time or space or energy or whatever that particular piece of science fiction actually devotes to its science, in which case we might even rank Interstellar above Gravity, and The Martian could be then the highest because of just the amount of science and scientific knowledge and scientific spinning of possible futures that goes into The Martian and then Interstellar and then Gravity. So I think depending upon, you know, how we're ranking hard science fiction totally changes just the ranking of those three, as far as like what I'm putting first.
It does. Which brings me to another possible misconception that we could add to our list.
Yeah.
Which is like, and maybe you can help me phrase this better, but hard sci-fi stays hard or doesn't alter with age. Because what's hard science fiction today, like there's going to be stuff that might have been considered hard science fiction according to the same standards 20 years ago that doesn't hold up because, say, like it's not, like we've passed 1984, it's no longer 1984, or we've passed 2001, so 2001 A Space Odyssey, like doesn't hold it, or like a lot of, that's just an example of text with, you know, dates in the title.
Right.
You know, like science fiction ages, and that's
yes,
like all literature, it ages, and so we have to take that into account when we're talking about how do we describe it. Because if we talk about Frankenstein, like go all the way back, like was Frankenstein hard sci-fi? Question mark.
That's an interesting question, and I mean we see it immediately. Like we don't even have to go back far at all. The Martian is a perfect example of rovers on the ground, Curiosity on the ground on Mars, our imaging capability from satellites around Mars, telling us things that are not invalidating, I think that's too strong of a word, but are pointing out some things that we didn't understand when folks made The Martian, and now we understand better. And that, I don't feel like that invalidates it as a piece of science fiction by any means, but does it maybe call into question its hardness? Like you said, like is it, and
like,
and
should hard sci-fi, the definition and the term, operate independently of age, or should it be tied to, like, should we only allow books to be called hard sci-fi if they age really well? You know?
Yeah.
Because, like, okay, a great example which could complicate in a pleasurable way our definition is the Mars trilogy by Kim Stanley Robinson. That kind of takes the Martian issue where, like, we've not invalidated but broadened our understanding past what we knew at the time that the text was created.
Yeah.
Because if any of you have read the Mars trilogy, especially Red Mars, because it's a multi-generational thing, and the third book is like set way far in the future, way far in the future, whereas Red Mars, the first one, is less so. It's a Mars colonization story, and you have people roaming around on the surface of Mars, like exploring it, settling it, but there's no fines. For example, the super fine particulates in the air on Mars, which we've now realized are there and are toxic. They're perchlorate. So they're like really hostile to human life, at least. There's a lot less water than we thought at the time. Like he thought there was a lot of underground water on Mars. And that's like a major plot point of the book, unleashing the water, which is cool. Like it's a great scene. Someone dies, which is perfect. So like it's a great example that pushes that particular issue, the possible invalidation of a text, far as it can go.
Yes, and if I can continue on that historical train of thought, I think there also, if we're thinking about that, there also needs to be a social component. Because, for example, going back to, say, 40s and 50s science fiction, even if they were the hardest of hard sci-fi novels, the engineering, spot on, the physics, perfect, nothing faster than light, the chemistry was great, maybe the biology was great, maybe all of those precepts stand, maybe there was nothing ecological, nothing's changed in our understanding, and yet all of the characters were men. All the engineers were men, the physicists were men, there was not a woman in those books anywhere. And again, I'm not thinking of a specific book, I wish I was, because that would make this argument a little bit stronger, but the fact that all of that science may still be technically correct, and yet the book didn't predict that it wouldn't be only men working in those fields, and only white, straight men, that we would have no one else, no diversity. They didn't, correctly say that. I wonder if that casts a shade over the potential longevity of some of those books. And I know probably if we're thinking in 50 years about the Mars trilogy, we might have, or someone podcasting in 50 years, podcasting is still a thing. If they're flying cars, let me know. But, that might be something that folks look back on and say, oh, well, there were some really good ideas for the time, but this is very much a product of its time socially, and for whatever reasons, maybe there's, some idea that Americans and Russians and Chinese folks and the other political organizations represented in the Mars trilogy, that kind of thing could happen is just utter nonsense now for whatever reason. And so, you see what I'm saying? Like,
I do. I think Kim Stanley would be tickled pink, to steal a phrase from my dad, if, say, like 100 years from now, he was being compared to Edgar Rice Burroughs. Like these authors who thought that they were kind of using real science in order to carry out stories, to make a certain plot happen in a place where it could only happen if they did it with this particular environment. Like the Mars trilogy is specifically discussing the psychology of settlement, and the psychology part is actually the most interesting, I think, at this point to me about the Mars trilogy. I actually am interested in rereading it, which is pretty unusual for a book of that thickness. But yeah, because I compare it to some of the other books produced by the same author, Aurora, 2312, and now New York 2140, which I haven't read yet. I'm working on the Science in the Capital series instead. They all are actually more interested in the human story, but their human story could only take place by removing it physically from this planet or placing it on a planet in peril, in the case of the Science of the Capital series. So I think there's a certain element of Kim Stanley wrote these books the way he did because he had to in order to tell the story that he wanted to.
Yeah.
Which is possibly why Gravity is the way it is too. Interstellar, I don't know. Like, you possibly could tell the kernel of that story, the love is gravity and that sort of thing, some other way. But I also think that in a lot of ways, Interstellar shares a lot of DNA with Arrival, which we've talked about a lot, in terms of, like, the heart of this story is shrouded in this scientific language and the scientific structures. It's made possible by this science, but the point isn't the science. And they do a particularly good job of letting the audience know that the science isn't the point, but still making the science pleasurable and a part of that story. Whereas, like, in a lot of quote hard sci-fi, I feel like the science is the point, perhaps, and then the characters get lost. I think that's an easy problem in a book that is trying to be hard sci-fi.
Interesting. So, yeah, I think that's definitely an important point to keep in mind, that hard science fiction isn't just using the science as a way to explore character or explore story, but the science is intimately integrated into all of those things. And yet, even as I'm saying that, I can't really make a strong argument for myself that, for example, in Arrival, or the short story it's based on, that isn't so. Like, the linguistic science is so embedded in character and in story and everything that goes on there. And I'm comparing this.
It's messy, isn't it? It's so messy.
Yeah. And I would probably, honestly, if you had thrown Arrival at me as, is it hard science fiction or isn't it, I would have said yes. My knee-jerk would have been yes there, because it handles the linguistic science so smartly. And again, like, maybe the plausibility of the aliens, the plausibility of their travel, etc., don't fulfill a lot of the qualifications that hard science fiction traditionally fulfills. But the fact that there is such hardness to the linguistic science makes me wonder if, is that hard science fiction, just in a different way? And I want to, before you answer that question, I want to also involve Contact here, because you made the note before we began recording that Contact would probably not be considered, or you wouldn't necessarily consider Contact hard science fiction, even though the techno jargon is mostly correct, mostly accurate. And because that's mostly accurate, you might say, well, Contact is mostly a hard science fiction novel or movie, even though it veers away from that at points. So I wonder how maybe we could talk about Interstellar, Arrival, and Contact as things that are breaking what we know hard science fiction to be, that sort of like either or, again, but how they're doing it pleasurably.
Well, I would even broaden our palette even further and include, like, the natural history kind of sci-fis. So a specific example is actually A Natural History of Dragons, which is a science fiction book which purports to be like a 1800s memoir by this woman dragonologist who's roaming around, and it's like dragons are a part of the everyday universe. Dragons are obviously fantastical, but the language and the world in which she sets her scene is the language of 1800s a natural history. So it would be what was considered hard science in the 1800s. And then you also have, like, another parallel would be, say, the Robert Frobisher storyline in Cloud Atlas, which is another science fiction work which uses the natural history structure and frame to examine science fictional core truths or principles. And so, like, that's recurrent as well. So let's include the natural histories. Let's include perhaps the techno-jargonish or science-o-jargonish texts like Contact. And yeah, so like, let's take them all and all at once. And so rephrase your question, including all of those.
So is there a way for hard science fiction to represent whatever sciences it's trying to represent in a way that does so in a hard way? I'm trying to find another way to say that, but, you know, in a way that sort of like, at the same time, it undermines this idea that hard science fiction has to be physically, chemically, geologically, etc. accurate, and maybe exchanges that for an 18th century understanding of biology or a current understanding of linguistic science, but is nonetheless very accurate to those things at the expense, perhaps, of our modern understanding or the inevitability or the likelihood of those things happening in the future. For example, alien arrival in Arrival.
So I'm torn in twain over this, because I would say like 80% of me wants to say, well, at that point, the term is just, it's so general, it's lost its specificity and its values and its specificity, right? Like, it has to have some sort of meaning in order for us to use it. And the other 20% of me is like, no, I need hard sci-fi in my life. So there's a part of me which is still saying there's something useful and attractive specifically about things that purport to be hard. Yeah. And the term would not include in general works like Interstellar and Contact, which contain interactions with something alien or divine or far future us that couldn't possibly be predicted. You know, that's Interstellar, like that what Interstellar is. And it wouldn't include like Dune, which in no way, shape, or form is some sort of inevitable future we might face. Like spice is fantasy and sandworms are fantasy. And so like we have, I think my knee-jerk reaction is in part away from the fantastical. Because I need fantasy for some reason to exist in a separate but connected universe that I can dabble in as it needed, but isn't bleeding wholesale into sci-fi, and I don't know whether that makes me a bad person or not.
No, I totally get what you're saying. Like, you know, it seems like a potential consequence of redefining and opening up what hard science fiction can do in the effort to make hard science fiction, you know, really trying to transgress those borders and make it more palatable and more open maybe to readers who are turned off by, say, 40s and 50s hard science fiction. You know, you end up maybe collapsing some of the possibility that you could have in softer science fiction, science fantasy straight up without any pretense of being scientific. Like, and that's maybe doing those a disservice at the same time we're trying to do a service for another category.
Yeah, and like, so Jim Grimsley is actually a great way of talking about this particular issue, because he is would you call him like a queer sci-fi writer or a feminist sci-fi writer?
I would say probably queer is closest.
Okay, so he's still writing today, but he probably came of age in the 90s, would you say?
I would agree with that.
Like his height was around there. So Kirith Karen is probably his seminal work. And Kirith Karen, would you say, is straight up fantasy? With sci-fi elements, maybe?
Maybe, yeah.
And it's sequel, which I read, and honestly, I can't even remember the title, even though I read it just a couple weeks ago. I'm a terrible person. Anyway, its sequel that I read was set in the future of the same world as Kirith Karen, only this world has been connected by a semi-magical, semi-technological bridge to a world that has no magic and no fantasy, and it's a technologically advanced world. And the whole, and I've listened to some, well, not listened, I've read some interviews with him and some critical work that he's done, which talks about how he was deliberately trying to mash up a science a technologically advanced world with a fantastical world to examine the intersection between sci-fi and fantasy. But the assumption there is always that they're distinct things that might work together and might merge a little bit, but they're still separate. And I feel like that's where I'm coming from, is this built-in brainwashed, perhaps, expectation that science fiction and fantasy must or always will in some way, shape, or form remain distinct. Oh my goodness.
Huh. Yeah. That's... Wow.
My brain's on fire.
That is a brain bender. I think that is definitely a segue into another conversation we should have about this. But may I suggest that we wrap up talking about hard science fiction today with Margaret Atwood.
Ooh. Okay. What do you want to talk about her about?
Well, you made some notes about Orcs and Crake, and I believe you were quoting from something that Margaret Atwood had said in response to Orcs and Crake and the other books in that series. Where's this sourced from?
Okay, so it's actually sourced from a Science Friday segment, and Science Friday is a Public Radio International broadcast, but it also gets reissued as a podcast every week, and that's how I internalize it, because I am not out wherever they are in, is it Boston or New York? New York, I'm guessing. Somewhere out east where they've got cool accents. And so this is an interview she carried out either with them or that they interviewed her off screen and then talked about it a little bit on the show. But she was talking about speculative fiction. And she wrote that the prospect of limited resources was what she had in mind, like at the front of her mind when she pictured the future. And she says, quote, "I think for the first time in human history, we see where we might go. We can see far enough into the future to know that we can't go on the way that we've been going forever without inventing possibly a lot of new and different things." And she was talking specifically about like alternative energy sources and like reducing our carbon footprint and all of that wonderful stuff. But she'd also pointed out that many of her supposedly far-fetched inventions have already come to pass. And actually, this is something Kim Stanley Robinson has written about his own work as well, specifically the Science of the Capital series. Like, it's less science fictional now that it's science fact. Like, big chunks of this is science fact. So Orcs and Crake includes genetic modification under a heavy corporate hand, corporate cities and corporate loyalties instead of national loyalties. Pretty much the genetic, like there are specific genetic things that she talks about, like hybrids that were invented this year that she wrote about in Orcs and Crake maybe 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah. And
so she kind of foresaw that. And she was thinking a lot about CRISPR, the genetic tooling package, when she was writing Orcs and Crake. And it's like the future caught up to a little faster than she was expecting. And she writes that the things in the book that people may think are very weird, and they may think that I just made them up, some of them already existed when she was writing the book. So she based her book on stuff that was already science fact. Then she wrote some things on top of that were science fictional that have become science fact. And so a lot of her book, even though it's set in the future, like the science part of it has already happened, and people are saying she's super prescient. And they're saying this about her Handmaid's Tale, like the social science of the Handmaid's Tale as well.
Yeah.
So, like, there's a certain tension there, I think, that's ongoing and that's really pleasurable and useful to the science fictional community. The dialogue between where we see ourselves going and where we end up, and where we maybe end up there exactly like we have with Orcs and Crake things, or maybe we land there inexactly like The Handmaid's Tale, which was written 25 plus years ago, where we've hit certain things on the nose, but we also don't have like actual handmaids and like the forced impregnations and things, at least on a grand scale in America. So yeah, like I think that would be, as we kind of try to wrap up the podcast, and I realize my flu brain has just completely taken over, and I've just vomited all over my computer.
Fine.
But like Margaret Atwood makes a nice end piece to the opening where we were talking about The Martian and some of these other texts, which are like on the mole scale, like hard-ish, and Orcs and Crake, which she's written, is hard-ish. But The Handmaid's Tale is less hard. It's like medium hard. And so authors like Kim Stanley, like Margaret Atwood, presumably like James S.A. Corey, once they're done with The Expanse, which will be in 20 years, they will write a range of texts which do different science fictional things with the notion of hard science. And I kind of want to see what hard science means 20 years from now, and I know that that's cheating.
Yeah.
You know. Will they have figured it out, do you think?
Oh, yeah. They'll have solved science by that time.
They will have solved science?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, dear God.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, where do you go from here? It's kind of like, okay, we've had a
Yeah.
great conversation about how we don't know what science is. Or like
Right. No, I was just thinking about that. I was like, there is no easy way to wrap this up. And I want to say that, like, you know, oh, that's an awesome thing. We talked about all the ways that hard science fiction can be hard, and like the different ways and the spectrum, and
No
blah, blah,
way,
blah, blah.
no
And
way.
I actually would like to have some sort of goddamn answer by the end of this podcast, but
Well,
I
let's
don't
do a
know
list.
that they're... Yes,
we
all
can,
right,
we
go
can
ahead.
do a list.
Yeah.
We can
Yeah,
at
yeah, yeah.
least
Okay.
like bullet point a couple things.
Okay.
So, misconception about hard science fiction number one. It's an either or proposition. It has to be hard or it has to be soft.
Yes, I still stick by that. I
Still
think
stick by that.
is
Check.
a misconception.
Misconception number two. Hard science fiction is better than regular science fiction or soft science fiction.
I think that is fairly pervasive. So yeah, I would probably stick by that too.
Third misconception. Hard science fiction is rooted in the physical sciences only.
I think we have definitely talked a lot about that, and that is probably the messiest misconception. I think that maybe was more true once. Is it still true now for everyone, for every reader and writer and publisher and editor? No, but I don't think anything was. I mean, that's kind of a nonsense statement. I don't think it was back in the day either. But is there still a sense that physics is first? I would say
first.
Probably.
Okay. And I would say that perhaps China Miéville and Ted Chiang are helping to move us past that definition. Thank you, guys. Fourth and final misconception that I can read my handwriting on. Hard science fiction doesn't alter with age, or the definition doesn't alter with age. I think we didn't get to talk about that one as much, but there is something about how science fiction ages which plays into how we receive it as hard science fiction.
Yes, I agree. And I wonder something like Margaret Atwood's Orcs and Crake. You know, again, if we look at that in 20 years, what will people think? Will they be looking at it and saying, oh, wow, she was really prescient and knew exactly what she was talking about and really channeled that current science that she was dealing with and, like, predicted what was coming next. And I don't know. I mean, do people look at it now and recognize what she was doing? I think a lot of people do, for sure. But, you know, is the potential for aging well? Is hard science fiction a good wine?
I think.
Yeah, I don't know.
I think it will be interesting because you could have Margaret Atwood, and in some sense she shares a lot of DNA with this other person I'm going to compare to, Ursula K. Le Guin. A lot of Ursula K. Le Guin might have been harder, and I'm using major air quotes around that, when she wrote The Dispossessed and some of her Laugh of Heaven series. Certain books in that were fairly hard at the time. But now we read them and we're like, we appreciate them, but we don't tend to read them for the science so much as the characters, because she created memorable characters. So maybe what we need the hard science books to produce, like, we tend to be a little bit more forgiving as they get older, or we tend to privilege characters over science once a book reaches like 20 years of age or something. I don't know. That would be a curious sort of test to kind of apply to ourselves.
It would be. Yeah.
I think my final thought today would be our definitions of what's useful as descriptive terminology is changing in a lot of fields in a lot of ways today. Something that brought this to mind was a piece that was on planetary radio a couple weeks back. And it's probably like a couple months back now because my brain, but it was a piece on a paper that was published by planetary geologist Kirby Runyon, in which he redefines the definition of planet. And so like planets had been defined as satellites of the sun, but if it's orbiting something else that's orbiting the sun, it can't be a planet, it has to be a moon or a satellite. You know, like, and that's not useful for a planetary geologist necessarily. So he was talking about how maybe we should reframe the description of planet or the term planet to describe the material characteristics of this thing. So it has enough mass to pull itself into a circular shape or spherical shape. So on and so forth, instead of like its orbital situation. So maybe what we need to do with hard sci-fi is stop looking at the binary, like we kind of talked about a little earlier on in the show, and start thinking about the unique possibilities that science fiction, which has a concern about its science, a central concern about its science, what that can open up. And maybe like the material characteristics, as we accrue more of it, maybe we can start breaking it up into more useful categories than just hard versus soft. Yeah. That would be where I would end. What do you think?
I think that's an awesome way to end. And I am going to give you some snaps and say, yeah.
That was 2 snaps. So that's like good, but not awesome. So I will work on that.
There were more snaps. I was just talking over them.
So, Tony, where can you find us?
You can find us not in the phone book, because who has one of those fucking things anymore?
I have 4.
You can find us... oh, do you? I actually have one. I'm not in it. I was using it for paper mache. Anyway, so you can find us online. The podcast is hosted directly on iTunes and on SoundCloud in both places as The Imaginaries. You can also find all of our back episodes, including that Novum episode that I mentioned, on YouTube, because iTunes and SoundCloud only host our last 6 episodes. We are at home on the internet at www.imaginaries.us. And you can follow us on Twitter at imaginary_pod.
Yes, that sounds awesome. I think you covered all the bases. We don't have a cool YouTube handle yet because we haven't been around long enough, but you can find us by Googling the Imaginaries on YouTube, and we share our visual brand, our little logo across all of it. So you can find us. Totally. So thanks for listening today. We have some interesting, very messy ideas about what we'll talk about in the future.
We do.
Some of them are crazy. It's going to be great. Have a lovely life, human beings who are listening to this podcast, and we will catch you again soon.
Later.